Hey everybody, welcome back. I hope you had a great spring break. I'm sorry I can't be here today, but you may recall on the Friday before break, I mentioned I had a doctor's appointment. So I will see you tomorrow. All right, today's lesson is on cultural diffusion. So if you have the Google document up and ready, excellent. If not, take a moment and pause and go to the Google Classroom and pull up the Google Doc titled Cultural Diffusion. All right? Okay, so welcome back. And today's lesson is on cultural diffusion. Let's break down that term. You have the document, looks a little bit like this. You're going to be filling out each of these 9 boxes here with a definition, an example that I'll offer you, and then an example of your own. All right, so we've got direct, indirect, and forced diffusion. And then after that, you're going to add 3 things or 3 examples of how cultural diffusion has impacted or shaped our town of Carpinteria. Okay, so first of all, what is it, cultural diffusion? Well, culture, as you know, is the knowledge, customs, and beliefs of a group of people. Diffusion is the spreading of something more widely. So together, a definition, a working definition for cultural diffusion is the spread of knowledge, customs, and beliefs from one group of people to another. So at the top of your document, right underneath that title, I want you to add that definition, the spread of knowledge, customs, and beliefs from one group of people to another. Now, let's talk about the 3 types of cultural diffusion. One is direct diffusion, and the definition of that would be the spread of cultural ideas between 2 groups that are naturally close to one another. So take a moment, and in your document, you're going to add that definition right there. That's the place where you're going to put the definition for direct diffusion. Now, I'm going to offer you an example. Well, let's talk about food. Now, if you think about how Mexico and the United States share a border, and that border in some cases is just kind of a arbitrary line, right? Culture moves beyond that line. So the beliefs, customs, traditions, including clothing and music and food, are going to spread both ways, right? So tacos like these being so delicious, you can imagine they're naturally going to spread into the culture of the United States. So if you have a favorite type of Mexican food, maybe you can list that. If you want to just title it Mexican food as an example, that is a great example of cultural diffusion and direct diffusion of how that has shaped the culture of the United States. Okay, so once again, that example that I offered you there is going to go right there. And now just pause this and come up with an example on your own, another example of direct diffusion. And then we'll move on to indirect diffusion. Now, very similarly, it is the spread of cultural ideas, but in this case, it's between 2 cultures without living near each other. So you could have people living on the other side of the planet who come into contact with ideas, say through the television or social media. Whatever it might be, it's ideas that spread. And so I'm going to go back in time and talk about something that has really changed the world. So around the time of the Great Depression or World War II, a lot of these guys were growing up in the United States. And you might recognize some of these people. They're very, very famous. You've got people like Robert Johnson, and Johnny Cash, and Elvis Presley, and Ray Charles, and Chuck Berry, and Little Richard, and Fats Domino, and the Everly Brothers, and the list goes on. These are the sort of founding fathers of what we might call rock and roll, right? Which is just classic American music. And as you know, American music and rock and roll has really shaped modern music. And to give you an example of how indirect diffusion took place, a lot of the records that these guys created were being shipped around the world. And they would come into ports in places far off, like England, where schoolboys would, get a hold of these records and play them, and they just became fascinated with this music and enchanted, and they wanted to create this kind of music of their own. And the perfect example would be like these guys. And if you're not sure who these guys are, these four guys are the Beatles, right? Schoolboys who grew up in England listening to those guys back in the United States, who had created this thing called rock and roll. And you would not have the Beatles if it wasn't for those founders of American rock and roll. And you might not have a guy like Bob Marley, who grew up in Jamaica, who would have listened not only to the Beatles growing up, but listened to those rock and roll founders as well, right? The Beatles, Bob Marley, American rock and roll, these are a great example of how indirect diffusion takes place. Okay, let's talk about the last one, forced diffusion. Well, as you see, this is when the spread of a cultural ideas takes place when one culture conquers another culture. And we could look at many examples in history, but let's keep it close to home. Let's take into consideration the people who lived here in California just 500 years ago, who had been here for tens of thousands of years, living in somewhat peaceful existence. They were not warrior cultures, but when the Europeans arrived, missionaries, Spanish missionaries, were intent on spreading their religion, bringing their culture to these Native Americans. Seeing that they settled down in one place, became farmers, became Christians, and when they came into contact, sometimes there was conflict, as you see in this picture here. Looks like the Spanish priest is being attacked, perhaps about to be killed by these Native Americans. However, with Spanish technology and the conquistadors and their weapons, as well as their diseases that they brought from Europe, eventually forced their culture upon those surviving Native Americans. And so Native Americans were forced to help build missions and to settle into a more, you might say, European or Spanish way of life versus their native cultures. And there's a little map of all the missions that were established throughout California in that time. We will learn more about this next year in 8th grade. All right, so there's the final definition. Cultural diffusion, you've got indirect, direct, and forced diffusion. Once you've completed these, I want you to turn to this last question and consider how these forms of diffusion have shaped our town of Carpinteria. Now, if you mention one of each type, that would be great. However, you don't have to. If they're all of one type, say direct diffusion, that's fine. But I want you to look around in your mind and think about our town of Carpinteria and consider how have cultures from afar shaped this little place we call home. List 3 examples and be sure you read over your examples, make sure they're clear, and go ahead and submit. I'm looking forward to reading yours and seeing you tomorrow, Tuesday, and stay safe and dry and healthy, and I'll see you mañana. All right, see you then. Bye-bye.